They knocked like they belonged there. Not politely, not hesitantly, like people who felt entitled to the space behind the door. I was standing in the kitchen when it happened, hands still wet from washing dishes, the sound sharp enough to make my stomach drop before my mind could catch up. When I opened the door, my ex-husband's sister stood front and center, flanked by a man in a wrinkled suit holding a folder thick enough to feel like a threat. Her lips were pressed tight, eyes scanning past me into my house like she was already deciding what needed to go. "Marissa," she said, not greeting me so much as announcing herself, "we need to talk." The man stepped forward and slid papers toward me without meeting my eyes. Eviction notice. I stared at the words, my name printed clean and clear at the top, my address beneath it. My address, the house I'd lived in for over a decade, the house I'd scrubbed, repaired, paid for, protected. "You have 30 days, the man said flatly. "Ownership is being reclaimed by the family." The family? I felt something hot rise up my chest. Not fear, not yet. Disbelief edged with insult. They spoke to me like I was a tenant who hadn't paid rent, like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. No mention of years I carried this place on my back, no acknowledgement of the nights I lay awake worrying about mortgage payments while their son drank away his paycheck. I laughed once, short, sharp. "You're at the wrong house," I said. My ex-sister-in-law tilted her head. "No, Marissa, you are the one who doesn't understand. That house was always meant to stay in the family." The audacity of it stole my breath. Always meant? I thought about the first year after the marriage started cracking, when he lost his job and never really looked for another. The second year, when I quietly took over the mortgage so we wouldn't lose everything. The third, fourth, fifth year, when I paid a loan while he promised it was temporary. Temporary turned into 10 years. I paid the mortgage, I paid the taxes, I paid for the roof repair, the water heater, the cracked foundation slab. And when the divorce finally came, it was quiet, almost polite. He took what little furniture he cared about and left without a fight. No court drama, no house dispute, just signatures and silence. Or so I thought. Standing there with those papers trembling slightly in my hands, I realized something important. They had been waiting for the divorce to finalize, waiting for the timing to feel right, waiting for me to be alone enough to intimidate. My ex-sister-in-law crossed her arms. "You should start packing. We don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Something in me went cold. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stepped back and closed the door slowly, deliberately, right in their faces. Inside, my heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I leaned against the door, eyes closed, breathing through the surge of emotion threatening to knock me over. Anger, hurt, exhaustion, and beneath it all, a quiet, dangerous resolve. They thought this house was theirs. They thought I was temporary. They didn't know about the file cabinet in my bedroom, the labeled folders, the envelopes with dates and notes scribbled in my handwriting, every mortgage statement, every bank transfer, every receipt I'd never thrown away because something in me knew, always knew, I might need proof one day. I walked down the hallway slowly, grounding myself with every step. The walls held memories not of him, but of me, my sacrifices, my labor, my survival. I opened the cabinet and pulled out the thickest folder. 10 years of truth. I sat on the bed and started flipping through the papers, my hands steady now. The fear that it threatened to take over was being replaced by something sharper, focus, clarity. They wanted to pretend I was a guest. Fine. I would remind them who paid for the keys they were trying to take. Because this wasn't just about a house. It was about erasing my contribution, my labor, my right to stand in a space I built. And as I gathered those documents into a single stack, one thought rang loud and clear in my mind. If they wanted a fight, they were about to learn exactly who they'd underestimated. Because I wasn't leaving this house quietly. And I wasn't leaving it at all. After they left, the house felt louder, not with sound, but with memory.
Every creak in the floorboards, every hum from the refrigerator felt like it was asking me a question, asking me if I was really prepared to defend what I knew in my bones was mine. I carried the folder to the dining table and spread everything out like evidence at a crime scene. Mortgage statements stacked neatly by year, bank printouts showing automatic withdrawals from my account month after month, year after year. Repair invoices with my name and signature at the bottom. I traced my finger along the dates, grounding myself in facts when emotion tried to rise. 10 years. That's how long I carried this house when the marriage stopped carrying me. I remembered the early days, the subtle shift when he stopped contributing just for a little while, how he'd reassure me without shame, "You're better with money anyway." How that sentence slowly turned into expectation instead of appreciation. By the time I realized I was the only one paying, it felt too dangerous to rock the boat. Too much was already at stake. I told myself it was easier to just handle it, easier than arguing, easier than starting over, easier than admitting I was alone in something I'd sworn would be shared. That lie cost me a decade. My phone buzzed on the table. His name. I didn't answer. A minute later, a text came through. "They came by today, didn't they?" My jaw tightened. So he knew. Of course he did. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This was coordinated, planned, executed with confidence they only get when they believe you're unprepared. I typed back slowly, "Yes," and they were wrong. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "You don't have to make this harder than it is, Marissa." That line hit me harder than the eviction papers. Harder for who? I stared at the message until my screen dimmed. Then I placed the phone face down and went back to my documents. I wasn't going to argue facts with someone who benefited from my silence for years. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. This house had held me together when my marriage fell apart. It had watched me cry quietly into pillows, watched me wake up early to go to work, watched me choose responsibility over resentment. Now, people who had never paid a dime wanted to claim ownership like it was tradition. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Saying the words out loud made everything real in a way I couldn't undo. I need help protecting my home. My voice stayed calm, but my hands shook as I explained. Divorce, mortgage payments, eviction attempt, forged confidence on their side. The lawyer listened, asked questions, precise ones. Whose name is on the deed? When was it last transferred? Do you have proof of payments? I smiled for the first time in 2 days. Yes, I said, I have everything. When I hung up, something shifted. Fear no longer had free access to my chest. It had to share space with strategy now, and strategy is a powerful thing when you've been underestimated. Later that afternoon, a certified letter arrived. I didn't have to open it to know who it was from. Their lawyer. The language inside was cold and formal. Ownership claims, family rights, assertions that made my blood pressure rise even as my mind stayed steady. They were confident, dangerously so. Confident people make mistakes. They assumed I didn't know what I had. They assumed I wouldn't fight. They assumed exhaustion would make me fold. I gathered the letter and slid it into my folder. Good. Let them assume. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that this house wasn't just a property to me. It was proof of my endurance, evidence of my labor, the one thing I'd protected even when I didn't protect myself. I spent the rest of the day scanning documents, making copies, labeling files. I moved with purpose now, every action deliberate, every step a reminder that I was done being polite about my own erasure. That evening, my neighbor knocked softly. "I saw some people here yesterday," she said carefully. "Everything okay?" I met her eyes and nodded. It will be. And I meant it, because somewhere between the knock on my door and the letter in my hands, something hardened inside me, not into bitterness, but into certainty. They wanted to take my house, but what they were really trying to take was my history, and I was done letting anyone rewrite it. The court date was coming, and when it did, I wouldn't just be defending a house, I'd be telling the full story.
one they never expected to hear. Preparing for court feels a lot like preparing for war. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, methodical. You don't rush, you inventory. You anticipate the other side's moves before they make them, and you learn to sit with the fear without letting it drive. My lawyer called it building the narrative. I called it telling the truth with receipts. We met in a small office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. I laid everything out across the conference table while he flipped through pages, eyebrows lifting higher the deeper he went. "These payments," he said slowly, tapping the stack, "they're all from you." "For nearly 10 years," I replied, "alone." He leaned back in his chair, nodding. "That matters." Those 2 words settled into my chest like a weight being lifted. That mattered. Not my marriage status, not their assumptions, not their entitlement. My labor mattered. Still, the days leading up to court were heavy. Every time the doorbell rang, my stomach tightened. Every unfamiliar car that slowed near the house made my pulse jump. They hadn't come back, not yet, but the threat lingered like a shadow. My ex-husband finally called again. This time, I answered. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice low and almost tired. "You know this is how my family handles things." I laughed softly, not from humor, but disbelief. "You mean by taking what they didn't pay for?" There was a pause. Then, "You could just walk away, Marissa. Start fresh." Start fresh? From the house I paid for? From the stability I built? From the space that held my entire adult life? "No," I said simply. "You don't get to rewrite history because it's convenient." He sighed. "You always make things complicated." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Complicated was what he called accountability. Difficult was what he called boundaries. And unreasonable was what he called a woman who refused to disappear quietly. I hung up without another word. The night before court, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the banister, the window frames. I wasn't sentimental. I was grounding myself. This wasn't nostalgia. It was ownership. In the bedroom, I paused at the dresser where I kept the folder, now thicker than ever with legal notes and copies. I closed it carefully, like you close something sacred. Court morning arrived colder than usual. I dressed deliberately, navy suit, pressed blouse, shoes polished, not for appearance, but for posture. When you look prepared, people hesitate to underestimate you. Outside the courthouse, I saw them. My ex-husband, his sister, a few relatives I recognized from family gatherings where I had always been polite, quiet, accommodating. They avoided my eyes, not from guilt, from discomfort. The truth has that effect when it's coming for you. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. No drama, no audience, just a judge, attorneys, and 2 opposing stories. Their lawyer spoke first. Family legacy, inherited rights, implied generosity. He painted me as someone who had benefited from access rather than someone who had carried the weight. He spoke confidently, quickly, as if speed could outrun facts. When it was my turn, my lawyer stood calmly and began laying out the timeline. Payment after payment, year after year, my name, my account, my responsibility. The room changed. I watched the judge lean forward slightly as the evidence stacked up. The deed, the transfers, the tax records, the maintenance expenses. Each document told the same story in a different way. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. Facts speak clearly when they're allowed to. My ex-sister-in-law shifted in her seat. My ex stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Their confidence drained slowly, replaced with something closer to realization. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was exposure.
As the judge reviewed the final documents, the room went quiet. I folded my hands in my lap, heart steady now. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. I had shown up fully, prepared, unapologetic. They could no longer pretend I was a guest, because the truth was sitting right there on the table, and it wasn't finished speaking yet. Forgiveness didn't arrive the way people describe it. There was no rush of peace, no sudden softening toward the past. It came instead as a question that kept returning at inconvenient moments. What am I still holding that no longer serves me? I asked myself that while reviewing contracts, while driving home late at night, while folding laundry in a quiet apartment that finally felt like mine. The answer wasn't my ex-husband, or his brother, or even the betrayal itself. It was the habit of bracing. I'd spent so long anticipating harm that I'd forgotten how to rest inside my own success. Every win still came with a mental checklist: what could go wrong, who might resent it, how it could be taken. That vigilance had once protected me. Now it was exhausting me. In therapy, I said it out loud for the first time. I don't trust ease. My therapist nodded like she'd been waiting for that sentence. She asked when ease had ever been safe for me. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the early years of the marriage, how responsibility had always come before recognition, how praise was often followed by control, how silence had been the cost of stability. Ease, I realized, had always been conditional. Letting go didn't mean pretending none of that happened. It meant choosing not to organize my future around it. I started practicing something radical: receiving. Compliments without deflection, help without guilt, rest without justification. It felt uncomfortable at first, like wearing shoes that didn't need breaking in, but slowly my nervous system began to catch up with my circumstances. At work, I delegated more, trusted my leadership team, allowed myself to be strategic instead of constantly operational. The company didn't fall apart. It thrived. Proof that control and care are not the same thing. My ex-husband reached out once more, weeks later. A short message. He said he hoped I was well, said he was finding his footing. I read it, felt nothing sharp rise in response, and archived it. No reply, no commentary. Forgiveness doesn't require access. One Saturday morning, I went back to the old neighborhood where the company first started, the coffee shop where I drafted our first bid, the hardware store where we priced supplies by hand. I sat alone with a cup of coffee and let the memories come, not as weapons, but as witnesses. I didn't rewrite them, I honored them. That version of me had been smart, capable, loyal. She hadn't failed, she'd been exploited. And exploitation says nothing about the worth of what's taken, only about the character of the person who takes it. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with outcomes. I wasn't carrying the past anymore. I was acknowledging it, then setting it down. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about him deserving peace. It was about me claiming it. And with that clarity came a deeper understanding. My power didn't come from winning in court or running a company successfully. It came from knowing I could survive betrayal without becoming bitter, that I could be precise without being cold, that I could be strong without being hardened. As I pulled into my driveway, phone buzzing with a notification from the office, another successful project signed, I smiled softly. Not because I'd proven anything, but because I finally trusted myself to enjoy what I'd built. And the final chapter of this story wasn't about the business at all. It was about the woman who would never again be invisible in her own life. The court finds... The judge's voice cut through the room, and every nerve in my body went on alert. That the plaintiff's claims of ownership are unsupported. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I had learned not to trust relief until it fully arrived. The judge continued, his tone measured, almost clinical, as if he weren't dismantling months of intimidation and entitlement with each sentence. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Miss Carter maintained sole financial responsibility for the property in question for an extended period of time. Mortgage payments, taxes, repairs, and maintenance were paid exclusively by her. My ex-husband's lawyer shifted in his seat. My ex-sister-in-law's lips parted slightly, the confidence draining out of her face in real time. For the first time since they'd shown up at my door, they looked unsure. The judge went on. Ownership is not inherited through assumption. It is established through contribution and documentation. There it was again. Documentation. I felt my shoulders loosen just a fraction, like my body finally believed what my mind had known all along. Still, the ruling wasn't finished. The judge flipped through the final pages, scanning, annotating, grounding every word in paper. Furthermore, he said, the attempted eviction lacks legal standing. There is no basis for removal of Miss Carter from the property. I swallowed hard. No basis. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I kept my face neutral. I had cried enough in private. This moment didn't belong to tears. My ex finally spoke, his voice tight. Your Honor, we were under the impression. The judge raised his hand without looking at him. Impressions are not law. Silence slammed down on the room. He leaned forward slightly. This matter is dismissed. Just like that. No flourish, no drama, no apology from the people who had tried to take everything from me. Dismissed. The word echoed in my chest long after it left his mouth. My lawyer turned toward me, a small smile breaking through his professional calm. Congratulations, he whispered. It's over. Over. I nodded, standing on legs that suddenly felt lighter and heavier at the same time. As I gathered my bag, I felt eyes on me. Not curiosity, not sympathy, but something closer to disbelief. They hadn't expected this. They'd expected intimidation to work. They'd expected silence. They'd expected me to fold the way I always had before. As I walked past them, my ex-sister-in-law spoke under her breath. This isn't right. I stopped, turned, and looked at her calmly. What isn't right is trying to take what you didn't pay for. She had no response. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, cleaner, sharper, like my lungs had more room. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the sun hit my face, letting the reality settle. I had won. But winning doesn't always feel the way you expect. There was no rush of joy, no sudden celebration. What I felt instead was a deep, quiet release, like a knot I didn't know I was carrying had finally loosened. My phone buzzed. A message from my ex. We should talk. I stared at it for a long moment. 10 years ago, that message would have sent me spiraling, searching for the right words, preparing to compromise, making room for his comfort even now. Today, it felt unnecessary. I didn't reply. Instead, I got into my car and drove home. As I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, brick warmed by the sun, windows catching the light, front door solid and unmoving. It looked the same, but I didn't. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me slowly, deliberately. Mine. I walked through each room, not to check for damage, not to reassure myself, but to reclaim the space with intention. I ran my hand along the banister, stood at the kitchen window, sat on the couch where I'd once calculated payments late into the night. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like something I was defending. It felt like something I was inhabiting fully.
Still, as empowering as the victory was, I knew something else was coming. Because when people lose something they feel entitled to, they don't always accept it quietly. And as I stood in my living room, phone face down on the table, I had a feeling deep in my gut that this wasn't the last time they would try to test my boundaries. They had lost in court, but whether they would respect that loss was a different question entirely. Winning in court doesn't end the war in your nervous system. The house was quiet that night, too quiet, the kind of quiet that lets old fears stretch their legs. I locked the doors out of habit, checked the windows twice, then stood in the hallway wondering when I'd started needing proof of safety even after I'd earned it. I slept lightly. Every sound pulled me halfway awake. A car passing, a branch brushing the siding. My mind kept rehearsing scenarios I told myself were irrational. Another knock, another letter, another attempt to scare me into leaving what I had just fought to keep. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the judge says dismissed. The next morning, I made coffee and opened my blinds wide, forcing myself into daylight. This house had been mine long before a courtroom confirmed it, and I wasn't going to let fear turn it into a place I tiptoed around. That resolve lasted until the mail arrived. A thick envelope, no return address I recognized, legal-sized, heavy. My stomach dropped. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and stared at it while my coffee went untouched. The old instinct tried to rise. Brace yourself, prepare for impact, expect more demands. Instead, I sat down and breathed. When I finally tore it open, it wasn't another eviction attempt. It was worse. A request. They were asking for compensation, claiming family investment, claiming emotional contribution, claiming they were owed something for allowing me to stay in the home during the marriage. I laughed out loud, a sharp, humorless sound that surprised even me. Allowing me. The audacity felt endless. They couldn't take the house, so now they wanted a piece of my peace. A payout, a negotiation, anything that kept their sense of entitlement alive. I read the letter twice, slower the second time. There was no legal threat buried in the language, just pressure, guilt, a suggestion that continuing conflict would be stressful for everyone. That word again, everyone, never me. I called my lawyer. He sighed when I explained. "They're fishing," he said, "seeing if you'll bite. There's no legal basis for this." "Do I need to respond?" I asked. "No," he said firmly, and I'd advise against it. When I hung up, I felt something click into place. This was the real test. Not the courtroom, not the evidence, not the ruling. This, the moment where I decided whether I would keep explaining my worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. I shredded the letter, not dramatically, slowly, methodically, piece by piece, until their words were nothing but thin strips of paper in the trash. That afternoon, I changed the locks, not because I thought they'd break in, but because it was time to stop leaving symbolic doors open, time to stop being accessible to people who only showed up to take. The locksmith chatted casually while he worked, asked how long I'd lived here. "Over 10 years, I said. He nodded appreciatively. "Solid place. You take good care of it." Those words hit harder than any courtroom validation. That evening, my phone rang. My ex. I let it ring. He texted instead. "You didn't have to go that far." I stared at the screen, calm settling in my chest like armor. This far. Protecting myself was too far to people who benefited from my lack of protection. I typed back one sentence. "Do not contact me again." Then I blocked his number. That boundary felt different than the others. Final. The days that followed were genuinely quieter. No letters, no calls, no surprise visits, just space. Space to breathe, space to exist without being watched or assessed or evaluated for what I could still provide. I started doing things I'd postponed for years, painting a room the color I wanted, fixing the garden, sitting on the porch in the evenings without tension humming under my skin. Ownership, I realized, isn't just legal, it's psychological. It's the moment you stop waiting for permission to feel secure. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house glowed warm from the inside out, I sat alone in the living room and allowed myself to fully feel it. Not triumph, peace. But peace has a way of attracting reflection, because now that the noise had stopped, I couldn't ignore the deeper truth anymore, the one that had nothing to do with them. For 10 years, I didn't just pay the mortgage alone, I carried an entire marriage alone. And acknowledging that meant confronting a grief I had postponed far too long. The house was safe, but my heart still had unfinished business. And the next chapter wouldn't be about defending what was mine. It would be about reckoning with what I'd given away.
Grief is patient. It waits until the danger passes, until the adrenaline fades, until the silence finally has room to stretch. That's when it shows up. Not screaming, not dramatic, just heavy enough to make your chest ache when you're standing still. I felt it one afternoon while reorganizing the hallway closet. It was such a small thing. I found a box tucked behind winter coats, taped shut and labeled in my handwriting from years ago. Marriage stuff. I stared at it longer than necessary before pulling it out. Inside were remnants of a life I thought I was building with someone else. Old insurance papers, greeting cards signed with promises that never matured into actions. A photo from early in the marriage, us smiling too hard like we were trying to convince the camera. I sat on the floor and let myself feel it. Not anger, not bitterness, loss. I had grieved the divorce in theory, but not in truth. I'd been too busy surviving, too busy paying, too busy holding everything together to stop and ask what it cost me emotionally to be the only adult in a partnership that was supposed to be shared. I thought about all the times I said, "It's fine, I've got it." All the nights I swallowed resentment because confrontation felt heavier than carrying the load. All the ways I trained myself to need less so someone else could stay comfortable. That realization hurt more than the eviction attempt ever did, because the court had exposed their entitlement, but this moment exposed my own pattern. I wasn't just a woman whose house was threatened. I was a woman who had normalized imbalance for years and called it love. I closed the box and didn't put it back. Instead, I carried it outside and set it near the trash bin, not to erase the past, but to stop storing it like it still defined me. I kept what mattered, discarded what didn't, and let the rest go. That night, I cried fully for the first time since the trial. Not quietly, not politely. I cried for the younger version of me who thought being chosen meant being necessary. I cried for the woman who believed endurance was a virtue. I cried for the years I spent waiting for someone to meet me where I already was. The tears surprised me with how cleansing they felt. Grief, when you finally let it speak, makes room for truth. The next morning, I scheduled something I'd postponed for too long, therapy. Not because I was broken, but because I was ready to understand myself without judgment, ready to unpack why I had stayed silent for so long, why I had accepted imbalance as normal. In those sessions, I learned something sobering and freeing. I didn't fail my marriage. I abandoned myself inside it. That distinction changed everything, because failure implies inadequacy, but abandonment implies choice, and choices can be unlearned. As weeks passed, I began to feel lighter in ways that had nothing to do with legal victories. I noticed how often I checked in with myself now before saying yes, how quickly I felt discomfort instead of overriding it, how much less explaining I did. Boundaries weren't something I enforced anymore. They were something I lived. One afternoon, while working in the garden, my neighbor leaned over the fence and said, "You seem lighter." I smiled. "I am." And it was true. The house felt different now, not just safe, aligned. It no longer held the echo of a life I was compensating for. It held me fully, without apology. But growth has a way of introducing new mirrors. As I settled into this version of peace, invitations began to come, social ones, professional ones, even romantic curiosity from people who had noticed my steadiness. And I knew the next test wouldn't look like eviction papers or legal threats. It would look like opportunity, connection, the chance to build again. And the question would be simple, but unforgiving. Would I recognize imbalance early this time, or would I mistake familiarity for comfort and repeat a pattern I had finally named? Because healing doesn't end when the danger stops. It begins when you choose differently. Opportunity arrived softly, the way it always does when it's trying not to be questioned. It came as an invitation to dinner from an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years, back when my life revolved around keeping everything afloat. She'd heard about the court case through mutual connections, congratulated me, said she was proud. Her voice carried admiration, not pity, and that alone felt different. "I want you to meet someone," she added casually. "No pressure, just dinner." Old me would have read into that immediately, imagined expectations, prepared to accommodate. New me paused. I agreed, not because I was lonely, but because I was curious. The restaurant was warm and intimate, low lights reflecting off polished wood. I arrived early on purpose. I wanted to enter the space grounded, not reactive. When they walked in, I stood to greet them calmly. Her friend, Daniel, was polite, observant, steady in a way that felt unfamiliar but not threatening. He listened more than he talked, asked thoughtful questions, didn't interrupt or steer the conversation toward himself. I noticed these things without romanticizing them. Awareness had become my new instinct. As the evening unfolded, conversation turned naturally toward life, work, transitions, lessons learned. When the subject of my divorce came up, I didn't minimize it. I didn't dramatize it either. "I spent a long time carrying more than my share," I said simply. "I don't do that anymore." Daniel nodded. That kind of clarity takes work. No flattery, no probing, just acknowledgement. I felt my shoulders stay relaxed. Later, when the check came, he reached for it instinctively, then paused. "Are you okay if I get this?" he asked, "or would you prefer to split?" The question startled me, not because of the money, but because of the respect embedded in it. He wasn't assuming, he wasn't testing, he was asking. "Thank you for asking," I said. "You can get it." And I meant that too. On the drive home, I checked in with myself the way therapy had taught me. Did I feel obligated? Did I feel rushed? Did I feel smaller? No, I felt present. Over the next few weeks, we talked more, slowly, intentionally. There were no emergencies, no financial confessions disguised as vulnerability, no hints about needing help or leaning too hard. Still, I paid attention. When he talked about his life, he spoke in terms of responsibility. When he mentioned challenges, he mentioned solutions. When money came up, it wasn't dramatic, it was practical. I noticed how my body responded. Calm, open, unbraced. That was new. But healing doesn't mean blindly trusting calm. It means verifying it. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sky fade into dusk, I told him the full story, not just the courtroom victory, but the decade that led up to it, the carrying, the silence, the realization. He listened without interrupting. When he finished, he didn't rush to reassure me or promise anything.
That shouldn't have happened to you, and I'm glad you protected yourself. That was it. No savior energy, no subtle positioning, just respect. After he left, I stood alone on the porch for a long moment, looking at my house glowing softly behind me. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I hadn't in a long time. Not love, partnership. Not someone to rescue, not someone to lean on, someone to walk beside. But the true test of growth isn't how you feel when things are easy. It's how you respond when old patterns are gently invited back in, dressed in better manners, better timing, better intentions. And that test came sooner than I expected, because a few days later, Daniel mentioned something casually, something small, something reasonable, something that would have gone unnoticed by the woman I used to be, but not by me. Not anymore. And the way I handled that moment would tell me, once and for all, whether this new peace was temporary or something I had truly learned how to protect.
He mentioned it the way people do when they don't want to seem like they're asking. We were walking through a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, the air cool and bright, vendors calling out prices, music playing somewhere down the row. It felt easy, normal, the kind of normal I'd spent years thinking was overrated until I didn't have it. Daniel stopped at a stand selling honey and laughed softly. "I'm thinking about making a move soon," he said, like it was just a passing thought. I didn't react, just listened. "My lease is up in a few months," he continued. "I've been weighing options." Options. That word used to slide right past me, used to sound harmless, neutral, but now my body paid attention before my mind tried to interpret. My shoulders stayed loose, but something inside me sharpened. "What kind of options?" I asked calmly. He shrugged. "Downsize, buy, maybe relocate closer to work." Still fine, still reasonable. Then he added, "You've built something really solid here." There it was. Not a request, not a suggestion, an observation. I nodded, letting silence do what it does best, create space. He glanced at me, reading my face. "Not saying anything has to change," he said quickly, "just thinking out loud." That sentence landed differently than he probably intended. Thinking out loud had cost me a decade once. I didn't confront him, I didn't accuse, I simply stayed present. We bought honey, walked a little more, talked about recipes. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. That afternoon, alone in my house, I replayed it carefully. He hadn't asked to move in, he hadn't hinted at money, he hadn't crossed a line, but he had noticed my stability. And noticing is where old patterns used to begin. I asked myself the questions I'd learned to trust. Did I feel pressure? Did I feel responsible? Did I feel like I needed to clarify or preemptively protect? Yes, that mattered. Growth doesn't mean assuming the worst. It means not ignoring your intuition just because the packaging is better this time. A few days later, we had dinner at my place. I cooked, he brought wine. We talked about work, travel, books. It felt warm, comfortable, but comfort doesn't cancel discernment. After we ate, he looked around my living room, genuinely admiring. "You really turned this place into a home," he said. "I had to. No one else was going to." He smiled, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Calculation. Or maybe I was projecting. I didn't know yet. What I did know was this. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. That changed everything. Later, as we sat on the couch, he gently said, "Can I ask you something?" I met his eyes. "Sure." "How do you see partnership now, after everything?" The question was honest, vulnerable, and it deserved an honest answer. I don't merge until there's consistency. I don't carry what isn't shared, and I don't build futures on potential. He nodded slowly. That makes sense, but understanding isn't the same as alignment. When he left that night, I locked the door and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the house settle around me. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't excited. I was observant.
The next morning, I woke up to a message from him. It read, "I've been thinking maybe we should talk about what this could look like long term." My phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have. Long term. That phrase used to thrill me, used to make me soften, used to overlook the fine print. But now it made me pause, because I knew something he didn't yet. Whatever that conversation turned into, whether it deepened or ended things, it would happen on my terms, with clarity, with boundaries, with no silent sacrifices hiding beneath the surface. But before I responded, before I opened that door even a crack, I needed to be certain of one thing. Was I ready to invite someone into my life, or was I simply standing at the edge of a pattern, waiting to see if it would repeat itself one last time? I didn't answer his message right away, not because I was afraid, but because I respected the moment enough not to rush it. Rushing had cost me too much in the past. I had learned that clarity doesn't arrive when you're eager, it arrives when you're still. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook open, pen resting between my fingers. I wasn't making pros and cons lists anymore. I wasn't negotiating with myself. I was checking alignment. What do I need now? What do I refuse to carry again? What does peace require? The answers came easily. I needed reciprocity. I refused financial ambiguity. Peace required transparency, early, not after damage was done. When I finally responded, my message was simple. "I'm open to talking," I wrote, "but I'm clear about moving slowly and keeping finances separate. That's non-negotiable for me." I hit send without my hand shaking. His reply came an hour later. "I respect that," he said. "Honestly, I'm relieved you said it." Relieved? That word surprised me. We met a few days later at a quiet cafe. No candles, no romance-forward atmosphere, just two people sitting across from each other with nothing to hide. I watched how he listened when I spoke, not just to the words, to the weight behind them. "I'm not looking for someone to save me," he said. "I've done that work already. What I want is partnership, not convenience." I studied his face as he spoke, not searching for perfection, searching for congruence. "Then we'll be fine," I said, "because I don't rescue anymore." He smiled softly. "Good. Neither do I." That conversation didn't solve everything. It wasn't meant to. It set a tone, a boundary, a standard neither of us rushed to test, and that alone felt revolutionary. Weeks passed, then months. No pressure to merge lives, no subtle expectations. We shared time, not resources, conversation, not obligation. When challenges came up in his life, he handled them. When challenges came up in mine, I handled mine. Support existed, but it didn't replace responsibility. One afternoon, while I was sorting mail, I found the deed to my house tucked neatly into a labeled folder. I paused, running my fingers over the paper, not because I feared losing it, but because I finally understood what it symbolized. This house wasn't just mine because the court said so. It was mine because I had learned how to stand in my own name. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who carried everything quietly, hoping someone would notice. I didn't pity her anymore. I honored her for surviving long enough to evolve. That night, Daniel stood beside me in the kitchen while I cooked dinner. He didn't offer to help in a performative way. He simply asked what needed doing and did it. I watched him without judgment. Consistency isn't loud, security isn't dramatic, and respect doesn't need convincing. Later, when he left, I locked the door and leaned against it, not from exhaustion, not from relief, but from gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for loss. I was present. Still, I knew this story wasn't just about love or court victories or boundaries learned the hard way. It was about something deeper, legacy.
what I would pass on, what I would warn against, what I would no longer tolerate, even in silence. And as I stood in my living room, lights low, house steady around me, I knew the final chapter of this journey wasn't about defending what was mine. It was about naming it, claiming it, and teaching other women how to do the same before they ever had to fight in court to prove what they already knew. Because the hardest truth I'd learned was also the most freeing. No one can take what you refuse to give away. And that realization was about to change everything. It started with a question from a woman I barely knew. We were standing in the checkout line at the hardware store, of all places, both of us holding paint samples and small talk. She glanced at my cart, then at me, and said casually, "You renovating?" I smiled, maintaining, protecting. She laughed, then lowered her voice. "Must be nice to have something that's really yours." Something in her tone made me look at her more closely, the tightness in her shoulders, the hesitation behind the smile. I recognized it immediately, that quiet uncertainty women carry when their stability feels conditional. "It is," I said gently, "but it didn't come easy." She hesitated. Then, like the truth had been waiting for permission, it spilled out. Her boyfriend wanted her to move in. He'd suggested she put her name on some bills to show commitment. She wasn't sure why it made her uneasy. She just knew it did. I felt a familiar ache in my chest. I didn't lecture her. I didn't scare her. I asked one question. "What would happen if you said no?" She blinked. "I don't know." "That's your answer," I said softly. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. That interaction stayed with me long after I left the store, not because it was dramatic, but because it was common, too common. Women taught to equate sacrifice with love, stability with selfishness, silence with peace. I started noticing it everywhere, at work, at church, in conversations that drifted toward relationships and money, women whispering about covering expenses, about carrying men through temporary seasons that never ended, about fear of rocking the boat when they were already tired from rowing alone. One evening, a local women's group asked me to speak, informally, about my court case. Just a small gathering, no stage, no microphones, just chairs in a circle and truth in the air. I almost said no. Then I remembered how alone I felt when those eviction papers hit my door. So I said yes. I told my story plainly, not to impress, not to dramatize. I talked about the years of quiet payments, the assumptions, the intimidation, the court, the relief, and the reckoning afterward, the part no one talks about. When I finished, the room was silent. Then the questions came. How did you know when to stop carrying him? What if I'm already too deep? How do I protect myself without feeling guilty? I answered the only way I knew how, with honesty. You stop when it costs you your voice. You're not too deep, you're just early in your awakening. And protection isn't cruelty, it's clarity. Women cried, women nodded, women wrote things down like their future depended on it, because sometimes it does. After that night, word spread quietly, not loudly, not online, through text messages and kitchen table conversations, women asking if I could talk to their sisters, their friends, their daughters. I wasn't trying to build anything, but something was building anyway. One night, as I sat alone in my living room, I realized something that startled me. My house had become more than shelter. It had become testimony, not because of the walls or the deed, but because of what I had learned inside it, what I had stopped tolerating, what I had reclaimed. Daniel noticed the shift too. "You're different lately," he said one evening, "in a good way." "I finally stopped making my lessons private," I replied. He nodded. "That takes courage." It also takes closure, because while I had forgiven the situation, there was one last thing I needed to do, not with them, not in court, not even out loud. I needed to acknowledge myself, the woman who stayed, the woman who paid, the woman who stood up when it would have been easier to leave. That acknowledgement, quiet but firm, was the final key, and once I turned it, there would be no more doubt about who this house belonged to. Not legally, not emotionally, not ever again.
I stood in the doorway one quiet morning and realized something had finally settled. Not the house, not the court case, me. The kind of settling that happens when your nervous system stops scanning for danger, when your shoulders rest where they're supposed to, when your breath doesn't rush ahead of you anymore, trying to anticipate loss. This house had seen me at my weakest, but it had also witnessed my becoming. I walked through each room slowly, not out of nostalgia, but intention. The kitchen, where I once calculated mortgage payments late at night, whispering reassurance to myself. The living room, where I sat numb after the divorce papers were signed, wondering how long I could keep carrying everything alone. The bedroom, where I stared at the ceiling, questioning my judgment, my endurance, my worth. None of those memories hurt anymore. They taught. I stopped at the front door and placed my hand flat against it, grounding myself in the present. No one was knocking. No one was threatening. No one was questioning my right to stand where I stood. For the first time in a long time, stability didn't feel conditional. I thought about the moment they showed up with eviction papers, how small they tried to make me feel, how easily people mistake silence for weakness, how confidently entitlement walks when it assumes you don't have proof. What they never understood was this. I wasn't holding on to that house because of fear. I was holding on to it because I had earned it. And earning something changes how you protect it. In the months that followed, life didn't become perfect, it became honest. Relationships moved at a pace that respected my boundaries. Conversations about money happened early, clearly, without shame. I didn't over-explain, I didn't justify, I didn't rescue. I chose reciprocity. I chose clarity. I chose myself. Women continued to reach out, quietly, privately, asking questions they'd never been taught to ask out loud. And every time I reminded them of the same truth that had saved me. Love should never require erasure. Family should never demand your silence, and stability should never feel like something that can be taken away at any moment. My house is still here. The walls are still standing. The locks are still strong. But the greatest thing I reclaimed wasn't physical. It was my voice, my authority, my refusal to disappear for anyone's comfort ever again. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. You don't need permission to protect what you've built. You don't need validation to stand in your truth. And you don't need to leave quietly just because someone else feels entitled to your sacrifice. This house was never borrowed, never temporary, never theirs. It was always mine. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.